So, at the end of part one, Lauri Allan Torni was arrested and detained by the Finnish authorities. So, now let's look at him after being detained up until the end of his life. Now, while in detention, Torni made the decision to escape. And this was not simply an act of evading the authorities, but an indication of the broader situation he faced. Remaining within the system meant continued scrutiny and limited prospects, whereas escape introduced uncertainty but also the possibility to control over his future. After escaping and being pardoned, he returned to Finland, and that changed significantly. Now, the country remained independent from any large outside influence. But its political position, on the other hand, was influenced by the Soviet Union. This affected not only foreign policy, but also internal decisions regarding individuals and institutions formerly affiliated with Germany. For former soldiers, particularly those with controversial wartime associations, this environment created additional challenges. Opportunities were limited, and there was an ongoing need to avoid actions that could be interpreted as politically sensitive. For Torni, this meant that reintegration into Finnish society was not straightforward. His skills were closely tied to military service, but the conditions that allowed him to operate effectively during the war no longer existed. At the same time, his past limited his ability to transition into a stable civilian role. Combination of these factors would ultimately influence his next decision, and that was to leave Finland, or more to sneak his way out of Finland to avoid arrest by the Soviet influence. Now, Torni made his way to Sweden, which served as an initial point of transition. However, this did not represent his final destination. Instead, it marked the beginning of a broader period of movement through Europe, during which his situation remained largely undefined. Now, during this period, he moved through various European countries, and he attempted to find opportunities that would allow him to re-establish his sense of direction. However, the broader post war environment combined with his personal circumstances made this very difficult. Europe at this time was still recovering from the effects of the war, and opportunities for individuals in his position were limited. Now, this process eventually led him beyond Europe. The United States, in contrast to the post war conditions he had experienced in Europe, represented a potential opportunity for a new beginning. It offered distance from his past, as well as the possibility of rebuilding his life within a different system. Now, reaching the United States therefore marked a significant turning point in Lauri's life. For the first time since the end of the war, there was the possibility of establishing a more stable and defined role. Now, this transition did not immediately resolve his situation, but it created the conditions under which a new identity and career could take shape. And it is this point that he took the process and the important step of adapting a new identity. Torni took the new name of Laren Allan Thorn, and he decided to join his third army, the United States Army. Now, his ability to adapt played a key role in this transition. Rather than relying solely on his past experience in the Finnish army and the Waffen SS, he demonstrated the capacity to function effectively within the framework of the US Army. And this allowed him to move beyond his previous circumstances and establish a new position based on performance rather than his background. By becoming Larry Thorne, he was not abandoning his previous identity, but restructuring it in a way that allowed him to continue operating as a soldier under entirely different conditions. Although he had been required to start over in formal terms, his prior experience quickly became evident. The skills he had developed during his service in Finland and Germany, particularly in small unit tactics, reconnaissance, and operating in difficult terrain, were directly relevant to the type of warfare the United States was preparing for during this period. And as a result, he moved into roles that emphasized these capabilities. He became involved with the US Armed Forces, or known as the Green Berets, a branch that focused on unconventional warfare, including reconnaissance, training, and operations conducted by small, highly capable units. This environment closely matched the conditions in which he had previously operated. The Green Berets required independence, initiative, and the ability to function effectively without constant oversight. These were qualities that had already defined his early military career, and they allowed him to adapt quickly to this new role. Within this structure, Thorne was able to re-establish himself as a capable and reliable soldier. His experience, combined with his ability to operate under pressure, contributed to his effectiveness in roles that demanded both technical skills and strong judgment. At the same time, his position within the US Army differed from his earlier services in one important respect. He was now operating within a large and more structured military system, with access to greater resources and support. And this allowed his abilities to be applied in more coordinated and sustained manners. His career during this period reflects a return to a defined role. After a phase of instability and transition, he was once again functioning within a clear military framework, where performance and capability were the primary measures of value. It's within this context that he eventually gets deployed to Southeast Asia, where his experience would again be tested in a new operational environment. Now, the one thing that we need to understand about Thorne is he was mainly going to this war because he was very much anti-communist, and he hated them with every fiber in his body. So he loved to kill communists during the battles that he was fighting. And that led him to the Vietnam War. Now, by the early 1960s, the United States had become increasingly involved in Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam. The nature of the conflict differed significantly from the large-scale conventional warfare of the Second World War. Instead, it was characterized by irregular operations, difficult terrain, unconventional warfare, and the need for small, adaptable units. For Thorne, this environment was not unfamiliar. The conditions of the conflict, dense terrain, limited visibility, and reliance on small unit operations closely resembled aspects of the warfare he had experienced during the Second World War. Now, he was deployed to Vietnam as part of his role within the US Green Berets. His responsibilities were consistent with the broader function of these units, involving reconnaissance, advisory roles, and operations conducted with a high degree of independence. Now, at the same time, the operational environment in Vietnam presented its own challenge. The terrain, the climate, and nature of the conflict required constant adjustment. Now, unlike earlier conflicts, there was no clear defined front line, and engagements were often unpredictable. Now, in 1965, during a mission in Vietnam, the helicopter in which he was traveling was lost in poor weather conditions. The aircraft crashed in a remote area and there were no immediate survivors. At the time, his remains were not recovered and his fate remained uncertain. And this marked the end of Lauri Allan service. After a career that had spanned multiple conflicts, countries, and military systems, his life concluded in the same environment that had defined much of his experience, uncertain, remote, and shaped by the conditions of war. Now, following his death in 1965, Larry Thorne's story did not immediately receive widespread recognition. His career had been unusual, spanning multiple countries, conflicts, and military systems, which made it difficult to place within a conventional narrative. For many years, his fate remained uncertain, as his remains were not recovered at the time of the crash in Vietnam or by the end of the Vietnam War. It was only decades later that the crash site was located and identified, allowing for the recovery of those who had been on board. Subsequently, his remains were formally identified and repatriated to the United States, and he was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, a location reserved for individuals who had served with distinction in the U.S. Armed Forces. And this is the only former Waffen SS officer that is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Now, this recognition reflects the latter part of his career, during which he served as a member of the United States Special Forces. And within this context, he is regarded as a capable and effective officer who contributed to the development and execution of unconventional warfare operations. But at the same time, his overall legacy remains very complex. His earlier service, particularly his association with German forces during the Second World War, continues to be a subject of historical discussion. Now, as a result, his life cannot be easily defined within a single national or ideological framework, outside of just being simply very anti communist. Now, what distinguishes his career is not simply the number of armies he served in, but the circumstances under which those transitions occurred. His experience was shaped by the political and military realities of the mid 20th century, rather than by a single consistent allegiance. Now, in this sense, his life reflects the challenges faced by individuals operating in periods of rapid and often unstable changes. His career moved across different systems, identities, and conflicts, yet remained consistently centered on military service. Now, Lauri Allan Torni therefore represents a case that is both unusual and difficult to categorize. His legacy is not defined by a single role or affiliation, but by the progression of his experience across the different contexts. So, that is why I consider him one of my favorite historical figures, as he wasn't just an ordinary man. He just fought in wars for the love of it. He absolutely loved fighting against the enemies of the countries he was living in. And that is the story of the soldier of three armies, Lauri Allan Torni. Thank you very much.